All right, welcome back to lesson 6 of nanoeconomics. And today we're going to be talking about one topic, just determinants of demand. And so a lot of times the vocabulary within economics presents that challenge because it's vocabulary that you don't always use. Sometimes it's because the vocabulary is common and you have a misconception of what it might mean in this context. But when it comes to determinants of demand, a lot of times it just becomes a mouthful for students who are new to the topic. Um, so the easiest way to just kind of always remember what these are things that shift the demand curve. That's it. So basically, they're factors that lead us to construct the demand curve in a different way. And there are 5 primary ones that we want to discuss for your standard classes and just kind of always understand. There are others that kind of get elaborated on as you get to the more advanced courses, but these are the primary ones that you really need to understand. And so we're just going to go through the 5 of them. And I went ahead and put just a demand curve graph below here. So just so that we're kind of looking at it and reading kind of the same graph. Let me see if I can't just bring this. Cool. So when we go up again, we're moving up in price. So down here is a penny, clear up here is $100 maybe. And as we move anywhere up here is still $100, and down here is still a penny, no matter how far left or right we go. And in the opposite way, the quantity is the only thing affected when we go left and right. So when we move to the right from the origin, we increase the quantity. So maybe this is 0 units and this is 100 units at the end. And as we move to the right, we increase the quantity, in this case, that's demanded, that we're talking about with the demand curve. And so with the original demand curve that's labeled here, the black line, is price 1 and Q1, or in other words, for quantity 1, maybe let's say it's 50 units, then the price would be here, and let's say it's $50, kind of sticking with the assumption that this is 0 and $100 and 0 and 100 units. These 2 points are roughly halfway. And so basically at a price of $50, there would be, say, 50 people who have lined up in line to purchase that item. And the structure of the demand curve is such that that first person in line in our imaginary scenario was the one who had the most willingness and ability to pay for whatever that item was. They had the most money in their pocket, in theory. Whereas this last person, they paid $50 and they only had $50 to spend, and they were only willing to pay $50 for that good. I just label these up real quick so that we've got some connection to the specifics that I've been talking about. So at the original demand, at a price of $50, we would demand 50 units. And that's given our known tastes and preferences for this good, how much money we have available for purchasing goods, the price of related goods. So that includes 2 different new pieces of vocabulary, complements and substitutes, and we'll talk more in depth about those in future lessons and in future videos. Expectations. So this one really comes into play nowadays when it comes to a lot of uncertainty in the markets related to what's going on in the world. Um, and then finally, the number of buyers in the market. In other words, if there are a lot of people interested in going to the concert, then the demand or the willingness and ability to pay for concert tickets might be affected, as opposed to, if it's a concert that not many people want to go to, then the price may end up being affected by that as well. So, for example, what I want to do is look at and kind of write in. Let me just see if it'll let me. This whiteboard app is just a little bit picky. Yeah. So what I want to do is kind of note what would cause this shift in either direction. So to move the demand curve to the right when it comes to first tastes and preferences, if our tastes were affected and that caused us to increase our demand for this good, it might be because we desire so if we prefer the good more, our tastes have changed and we want more of the good. That would be an example of a situation where taste or preferences improving would cause a rightward shift in the demand curve. When it comes to income, in order to have a rightward shift in the demand curve, that's pretty simple. We've got an increase in consumer income, or our disposable income, would lead to us increasing demand for what we call normal goods, or a situation where when we have more money available, the things we buy that's affected by our income availability, we would increase the quantity that we want to purchase of those. So the prices of related goods and like substitutes and complements. I'm trying to think of how we want to approach this, because we're going to focus explicitly on just talking about what determinants of demand are, looking at how we can kind of memorize and understand these 5, and then we're going to kind of move on to another topic for tomorrow. So that's kind of the approach I'd like to start taking now. To start with is focus on one topic, really go in depth on it, but not take too long, so that we have quick, accessible videos that we can refer back to later when we need to review and study. So for what we'll do is I'm going to skip related goods for now, and I'm going to come back to it in a second. I just need to kind of decide how in depth we want to go. For expectations, if we think so if we think that things are going to get better, basically if we're optimistic, it leads to a lot of surplus and excess purchases. So not necessarily in a negative sense, but for example, people who believe that their situation will improve would maybe look to go out and buy something new, or maybe get new furniture or update their car, because they feel like their situation is going to improve over time. So again, I always kind of try to remember that you can visualize demand in a simple sense as a line or a lineup for a product release. So if there's more buyers, that's more demand because that's more people in the line. And that would be the visualized line at the store as well as this demand line because there are more, like the quantity of people when we're talking about, we would have more of them represented here. So now what we want to do is kind of talk about the reverse. So a good example that I can that it actually comes up in a lot of multiple choice questions in like this level of economics, and it can be used in both contexts. Is For example, coffee. We've seen studies in the past that it's good for you, that it's bad for you. Same thing with eggs. Um, and sometimes when those studies get a lot of hype, they can actually affect consumer tastes and preferences and shift demand. As well as in the positive direction, when we think of the positive advertising campaigns and things like that, what they're aiming at is influencing consumer taste and preferences. So, both in positive and a negative sense, tastes and preferences are really what advertising are targeting. Let's note that here. So advertising is targeting our tastes and preferences. When it comes to income, again, this is pretty simple. A decrease in consumer income causes a decrease in demand or a left shift of demand. So another way that I commonly tell students to remember shift directions is that it's always left and right. If you consider it an up and down scenario, then it will get very confusing when we move on to supply. So left and right will be more reliable for you, and you can kind of trust that to remember, especially if you start with just left is less. Left is always less when we're shifting these curves because we're always moving back to the origin. Change these real quick. All right. And so the next thing we want to do is talk about expectations. And in this sense, if we're going to decrease demand with expectations, that's because there's pessimism. Um, so if you've heard the phrase tighten the belt, in a financial, personal finance context. This is what we tend to do when we expect, for example, if we expect a recession as a general public and we all tighten the belt and we all decide we're not going to go out to eat, we're not going to go to the movies, we're not going to go to the ball game, those kinds of things, that affects the people who work in those industries. They're taking in less income. Now they're less able to go, they have less purchasing power and spending power in the same community. And it's a kind of a chain reaction. So expectations of a recession can actually lead to a recession because it creates behaviors like tightening the belt that lead us to spend less, contracting demand. And then finally, number of buyers. Again, it's pretty simple. Fewer buyers, less demand. Fewer people in line. So now what we're going to do is real quickly just talk about price of related goods in substitutes and complements. And what we want to do is kind of break away for just a second, because I want to define substitutes and complements. So some examples of substitutes. Combo number 1 or number 2. Chicken or pork if you're ordering food, Pepsi or Coke. And the idea here is that you're not going to be having both. When you're torn between two items on the menu, you're not just going to order both in these scenarios. Not that close. Just do this. So we're not going to order both combo number 1 or 2. We're going to pick one, and they're going to be substitutable. So for example, if combo number 2 is higher priced, then and we see them as equally satisfying, we're going to choose combo number 1. And the opposite is true. So this is basically the price of that related good is affecting the demand for another good. So if we choose pork, we decrease demand for chicken. At the restaurant, for example, if we choose Pepsi, we decrease the demand for Coke. Or if we go with Pepsi because of differences in price when we see them equally. So the next one we want to kind of introduce is just the complements. So one example that we can kind of understand with this is why, like, you wouldn't purchase a good that required another good unless you had that other good. So smartphones and apps, milk and cereal, peanut butter and jelly, anything that you're going to look at and consider them as like a bundle or a total package together as opposed to separately. So if um, so the idea is that if one of them is the price of one of them is affected, the demand for the other will be affected. So, oops. Yeah, let's just do this. So this is what we're basically what we're looking at today is determinants of demand are things that shift the demand curve. Those 5 determinants of demand are tastes and preferences of consumers. So that's where advertising comes into play. Income, the prices of related goods and substitutes, our expectations in the market for ourselves and the economy, um, and then the number of buyers as well. So I kind of put them in that order just in case you're like a mnemonic type person. It can be tipping if you want. Um, and And we also looked at and talked about complements and substitutes as kind of additional vocabulary here. We also alluded to normal goods, but we'll get into that when we have a little bit more to say about some related vocabulary there. So, some key things to take away today are determinants of demand shift demand curve. Left is less. So if the thing would cause you to buy fewer of the item or decide to demand less of the good, then you're going to shift the demand curve to the left. And if it is going to cause you to demand more, you'll shift to the right. And so that's kind of going to do it for today. I'll clip this up and put everything on a highlight and then on YouTube. And over time, what I'd like to do is start building up a kind of library of quick vocabulary bits to help understand things in more practical terms so that when you read your questions, it makes sense to you intuitively as opposed to sounding like a foreign language that you are trying to memorize. All right, so thank you for tuning in. This was Lesson 6, Demand Part 2, Determinants of Demand, and we'll see you next time.